The rain started before my mother finished packing her bag. I remember that detail more than anything else. The way the water hit the window in uneven little bursts, like something outside was trying to knock and being ignored over and over, the same as me. I was propped up against 3 flat pillows, an IV line taped crooked into the back of my hand, and I watched her fold my father's jacket over her arm even though he wasn't in the room. He hadn't been in the room in 2 days. "You'll be fine here," she said, not looking at me, tucking her scarf around her neck like the hospital hallway was colder than the actual weather outside. "They have good doctors, better than we could ever manage at home." I wanted to ask her what "at home" even meant anymore, since home was the word she used for a place I clearly wasn't welcome to return to, but my throat hurt too much for questions, so I only watched her zip the bag, watched her check her phone, watched her walk to the door without once meeting my eyes. "Mom?" She paused. Just for a second. Long enough that some small, stupid, hopeful part of me thought she might turn around. She didn't. The door clicked shut behind her with a sound so soft it shouldn't have been able to break anything. But it broke something in me anyway. Some fragile string that had been holding my chest together since the diagnosis, since the fights. Since the moment my father looked at the paperwork that named what kind of person I was. Omega chronic high risk, and decided that the son he'd raised for 23 years had somehow become a stranger overnight. I lay there for a long time after she left. Long enough that the light outside shifted from gray to a deeper bruised gray, the kind that comes right before a hospital corridor goes quiet for the night shift. Nobody came to check on me for almost an hour. When the nurse finally did, she glanced at the empty chair beside my bed, then at the visitor sign-out sheet and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Abandoned patients weren't rare here. I could tell by the practiced blankness in her expression that she'd learned, a long time ago, not to react. I turned my face toward the window instead so she wouldn't see mine. That's when I heard it. A voice from the room next to mine, low and edged with something like restrained anger, cutting through the thin wall like the wall wasn't even trying. "I don't care what the insurance company says. Get me the specialist by morning, or I will find someone who can." I didn't know yet that the voice belonged to the person who would spend the following weeks refusing to let me disappear the way my own family had let me disappear. I only knew in that moment that someone on the other side of that wall sounded powerful enough to bend the world to his will, and I envied him for it with a rawness that surprised me, because I had never once in my life been able to bend anything toward myself. His name, I learned 2 days later from an orderly gossiping in the hallway, was Lee Hansen, Alpha. Corporate. The kind of patient whose room had actual flowers, instead of the sad little plastic cup of daisies volunteers left behind for people like me. The kind of patient whose family, according to the same gossiping orderly, hadn't shown up either. Not because they'd abandoned him, but because he'd apparently told them not to come. In a tone that made it clear the instruction wasn't up for debate. I found that strange. Who tells the people who love them to stay away? I didn't have long to wonder, because that was the day I finally saw him. I'd been shuffling down the hallway with my IV pole for the mandatory movement therapy the doctors insisted on, even though every step felt like wading through wet concrete. I turned a corner too fast, my balance tipped, and my shoulder collided with someone solid enough that I nearly went down entirely. A hand caught my arm, not gently, firmly, the way you'd catch something you refused to let break on your watch. "Careful," he said, and his voice was even lower in person than it had been through the wall, rough at the edges like he didn't use it for anything but necessity. I looked up and up, because he was tall in that particular alpha way that made a hospital gown look like something worn deliberately instead of something worn because there was no other option. Dark hair, darker eyes, the kind of face that didn't do anything so soft as smile. His jaw was set in a permanent, faint clench, like he was perpetually bracing for something to go wrong. "Sorry," I managed. My voice came out thin. Everything about me felt thin those days. My voice, my wrists, the version of myself I used to be. He didn't let go of my arm right away. His eyes moved over me with an assessment so quick and clinical, I almost mistook it for indifference. Except it wasn't indifference. It was the opposite. It was someone cataloging every visible sign of how badly I was hanging on. "You're the one in 4B, he said, not a question. You can hear me? The walls here are paper." A pause. "You cried last night." Heat flooded my face so fast it made me dizzy, or maybe that was just the illness. I didn't. You did. No judgment in it. Just fact, delivered the way he probably delivered every fact in his life, directly, without softening. "Where's your family?" The question hit somewhere raw and unhealed. I pulled my arm free of his grip, more sharply than I meant to. "Not here, obviously." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not pity. I would have hated pity, would have thrown it back in his face, but something colder and more useful. "Calculation." "Noted," he said, and walked past me down the hallway like the conversation had ended exactly where he wanted it to. I stood there gripping my IV pole, oddly breathless, watching his back disappear around the corner, and I didn't understand yet that I had just been marked as someone's problem to solve. The following morning, a nurse came in with a second breakfast tray. "I didn't order this," I said, confused, staring at the tray of actual eggs instead of the beige protein paste the hospital called scrambled. "Room 4A requested it be sent here," she said, unbothered, like this was a normal occurrence. "Said you'd probably refuse it if he brought it himself." I stared at the wall between our rooms like it might explain itself. It didn't. But 3 days later, when my fever spiked hard enough that I couldn't stop shaking, I heard raised voices through that same wall. His voice, specifically, low and furious in a way that made the nurses move faster. "His temperature has been climbing for 6 hours and nobody thought to escalate this?" "Sir, he's not your patient. He doesn't have anyone else checking on him. Someone should." I didn't hear how that argument ended, only that within 20 minutes, a doctor I hadn't met before was standing over my bed adjusting my medication, murmuring things about infection risk and omega physiology and immune suppression that I was too delirious to fully track. Somewhere in the haze, I thought I heard a door open. I thought, impossibly, that I felt someone sit in the chair beside my bed, the chair that had been empty since my mother walked out of it. When the fever finally broke 2 days later, that chair was empty again. But there was a folded blanket on it that hadn't been there before, soft in a way hospital linens never were, and a note in sharp, economical handwriting. "You scared several nurses. Don't do it again." No name. No name. He didn't need to sign it. I already knew. I held that note longer than I probably should have, tracing the harsh, slanted letters with my thumb, feeling something unfamiliar unfurl in my chest. Something that felt dangerously close to being cared for. Once I was strong enough to sit upright without the room spinning, I started talking to him. Not in person. Not at first. Through the wall. In the strange, private hours after the nurses did their final rounds and the hospital settled into its uneasy nighttime hush. "You're awake," I said one night, testing the theory, half expecting silence. "I don't sleep much." His voice came back immediately, like he'd been waiting. "Why not?" A pause, long enough that I thought maybe I'd asked something forbidden. Then, "Old habit. When you run a company, sleep becomes optional." "What company?" "Doesn't matter right now." Another pause. "Why doesn't your family visit?" I flinched at the abruptness of it, the way he cut straight past small talk into the wound. "You don't waste time, do you?" "I don't see the point in wasting anything, least of all time." A beat. "You don't have to answer." I stared at the ceiling, at the water stain shaped vaguely like a bird that I'd memorized over the past week from having nothing else to look at. My parents found out I'm omega with a chronic condition in the same week. They decided both things were too much of an inconvenience to keep around. I expected him to say something comforting and hollow, the way people always did. "So, I'm sure they still love you, I'm sure they'll come around." He didn't. "That's not an inconvenience," he said instead, flat and certain. "That's cowardice. There's a difference." Something in my throat tightened, unexpected and fierce. Nobody had put it that plainly before. Everyone else tiptoed around what my parents had done, softened it into something forgivable. He simply named it. "What about you?" I asked, needing to shift the weight off myself. "Why doesn't your family visit?" "Because I told them not to." "Why?" Because the last time my mother saw me weak, she tried to use it. Arranged marriage, board seat leverage, family obligations disguised as concern. His voice went colder, harder, each word placed like a brick. I decided it was easier to be alone here than to be used while I couldn't defend myself. I turned onto my side, facing the wall as if I could see him through it. That's a sad way to survive. It's an effective one. Those aren't the same thing. Silence again, but a different kind, considering, not closed off. No, he admitted finally, they're not. We didn't say anything else that night. But I fell asleep with my palm pressed flat against the cool wall between our rooms, and for the first time since the diagnosis, I didn't cry myself into it. They finally allowed the two of us into the same shared recovery lounge on the 9th day, a small sunroom at the end of the ward with mismatched chairs and a window that actually let in real daylight instead of the gray fluorescent kind. Lee was already there when the nurse wheeled me in, sitting with his forearms braced on his knees, staring out at the parking lot like it owed him something. He looked up when I entered, and for a second, neither of us said anything, like meeting face to face after all those late-night conversations through the wall had suddenly made us shy. "You look better," he said finally. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." Accurate. He gestured to the chair across from him. Not an order, not quite a request either, something in between, the particular tone of someone unused to asking for company but wanting it anyway. I sat. The sun through the window was warm in a way I hadn't felt in weeks, and for a moment I just let myself soak in it, eyes closed, IV pole propped beside me like a strange metal companion. "Can I ask you something?" I said eventually. "You've been asking me things through a wall for a week. Why stop now?" I almost smiled at that, the dry, clipped humor buried under all that coldness. "Why do you care what happens to me? We're strangers." He was quiet long enough that I opened my eyes to check if he'd even heard me. He had. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, like the answer was easier to give to the window than to my face. "Because," he said slowly, "I heard you crying through a wall on the worst night of your treatment, and nobody came. And I decided that wasn't going to keep happening while I was capable of doing something about it." "That's a very alpha answer," I said, trying to keep my voice light even though my chest had gone tight and strange. "I don't know how to give any other kind. You could just say you like me." The words left my mouth before I fully weighed them, some reckless, fever-loosened part of me testing the boundary just to see what would happen. I expected him to deflect, to retreat into that clipped efficiency he used like armor. Instead, something in his expression cracked open, just slightly, just at the edges. And for the first time since I'd met him, Lee Hansen smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It barely moved his mouth at all. But it reached his eyes in a way that changed his whole face softened. The perpetual clench of his jaw made him look less like a man bracing for disaster and more like someone who had, unexpectedly, found something worth not bracing against. "Maybe I do," he said. "Is that a problem?" My heart did something reckless and unwise. "No," I said. "No, it's really not. Not everything between us was gentle sunroom mornings and half confessions. There was a night deep into my 3rd week when my body decided to fight the treatment instead of accept it. Some cruel omega-specific complication the doctors had warned might happen but hadn't happened yet until it did violently. All at once. I remember the alarms more than the pain. The pain blurred into a single, unbearable note. But the alarms were sharp, insistent, and underneath them I remember hearing his voice again, louder than I'd ever heard it, arguing with a doctor in the hallway outside my door. "You are not sedating him without explaining what's happening first. Sir, you are not his emergency contact. You have no authority here. Then find someone who does, because right now there is no one, and I am the only person in this building who has spent every night for 3 weeks listening to make sure he's still breathing." I don't know how he won that argument. I only know that when the worst of it passed, when the fever broke and the room stopped tilting and my body finally grudgingly settled, he was there. Not in the doorway, not through a wall, but sitting in the chair beside my bed with his sleeves pushed up and his hand wrapped loosely protectively around mine. "You're an idiot," he said, voice rough, "for scaring me like that. You weren't supposed to be scared. Alphas don't get scared." My own voice came out cracked and small. "I'm not most alphas." "No," I agreed, tears sliding sideways into the pillow because I was too weak to wipe them away myself. "You're really not?" "No." He reached up without a word and brushed them away with his thumb, careful and unpracticed, like tenderness was a language he was only just learning to speak, and doing it clumsily on purpose because he refused to let that stop him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I need you to understand that. Whatever happened with your family, I am not that. I don't leave." I wanted so badly to believe him. I was terrified to believe him. Believing had cost me everything the last time, but I let my fingers curl tighter around his anyway, because some part of me, the part that had been left behind in a chair that emptied out weeks ago, decided it was worth the risk. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. There's a particular kind of fear that comes from overhearing your own prognosis through a door left slightly ajar. I wasn't supposed to hear the conversation between my doctor and the hospital's senior consultant that afternoon. I was supposed to be asleep, worn down from another round of treatment, but sleep had abandoned me the same way everyone else had, and so I lay there perfectly still and listened to two people discuss my body like it was a puzzle they weren't sure they could solve. Calmed up. The response to the second protocol has been inconsistent at best. If we don't see stabilization within the week, we may need to discuss more aggressive options, and given the omega-specific complications already present. Non 2 2 Non 2. Family history would help contextualize the risk, but there's no emergency contact listed, no next of kin present. I stopped listening after that. I didn't need to hear the rest to understand the shape of what they weren't saying, that I was, in the careful language of medicine, a difficult case with no one behind him. I didn't cry that night. I think I'd used up whatever reserve of tears I had left. I just lay there hollow and quiet until I heard the familiar sound of a door opening, not the doctor's, mine, and then his. The connecting one. The nurses sometimes left unlocked between rooms for reasons no one ever explained. Lee stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim hallway light, and something in my face must have told him everything, because he didn't ask what was wrong. He simply crossed the room, sat on the edge of my bed like it was the most natural thing in the world, and waited. "They think I'm not responding to treatment," I said finally, staring at my hands instead of him. "They said there's no family history to reference, no emergency contact." "Then list me." I looked up at that, startled. "What?" "List me as your emergency contact." He said it simply, like it cost him nothing, though I could see in the tight line of his shoulders that it cost him everything. Every wall he'd built, every instinct towards self-protection he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. "I'm already here. I'm not leaving. Make it official. You don't even know my middle name." "Then tell me your middle name." A wet, surprised laugh broke out of me despite everything. "It's Elias. Sean Elias Thomas." He said it slowly, like he was memorizing it, filing it away somewhere permanent. "There. Now I know it. Emergency contact requirements met." "You're serious?" "I don't joke about things that matter." His hand found mine again, steady in a way nothing else in my life had been steady in weeks. "You are not going to lie in this bed alone, facing whatever comes next." I refuse to allow it. "You can't just refuse illness, Lee." "No," he agreed, quiet and fierce all at once. "But I can refuse to let you face it without someone in your corner. That part, I have full control over." I didn't have an answer for that. I only had his hand in mine and the strange, terrifying, wonderful realization that somewhere in the last 3 weeks, without either of us fully choosing it, we had become each other's someone. My mother returned on a Thursday, 11 days after Lee became my listed emergency contact. She didn't come out of guilt. I understood that within the first 30 seconds, watching her eyes dart around the room cataloging, rather than caring, the flowers on my side table that Lee had started sending daily, the blanket he'd left. The general sense that someone was clearly, visibly taking care of me. "You've made friends," she said, in a tone that suggested this was somehow suspicious rather than good. "His name is Lee," I said carefully. "He's been here every day. And Alpha." She said the word like it explained something unflattering about me. "Sean, you need to be careful. People take advantage of Omegas in vulnerable positions." The audacity of it nearly stole my breath. This woman, who had zipped her bag and walked out of a chair she never sat in again, standing in front of me lecturing about vulnerability like she hadn't been the first person to exploit mine. "He's the only person who stayed," I said, voice shaking but not breaking. "You didn't. Dad didn't. He did. Every single night." Her mouth tightened. "We had reasons, you had excuses." The word came out sharper than I intended, sharper than I'd ever spoken to her before. But 3 weeks of Lee's blunt, unflinching honesty had rubbed off on me in ways I hadn't noticed until that moment. I heard the specialist say I might not have responded to treatment in time if someone hadn't fought for faster care. That someone was him, not you. She opened her mouth to respond, but the door opened before she could, and Lee stepped in, not dramatically, not with any performance of possessiveness, just quietly present the way he always was, carrying a bag of the specific ginger tea I'd mentioned, liking exactly once days ago, that he'd apparently remembered and gone out of his way to find. He took in the scene in half a second, my mother's rigid posture, my shaking hands, and something in his expression went very, very still. "Is there a problem?" His voice was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that belonged to someone choosing, very deliberately, not to raise his voice. "I'm his mother," she said, drawing herself up. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "No," Lee agreed, "we haven't." "Interesting, given how long he's been here." The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "I think," Lee continued, setting the tea down gently on the table like he refused to let his anger touch anything meant for me, "that Sean has had a difficult morning and needs rest. I'd appreciate it if visiting hours were kept brief." It wasn't a request. My mother seemed to understand that too, because after a long searching look between the two of us, a look that might have finally, belatedly, registered what she'd lost the right to, she gathered her coat and left without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, softer this time than it had that first terrible night, but somehow it felt louder, more final, like the last thread connecting me to who I used to be quietly severing itself. Lee sat beside me without a word, took my hand, and let me cry without trying to fix it, without filling the silence with anything except his presence, steady, unwavering, entirely mine. There's a particular vulnerability in being an Omega around an Alpha during a health crisis, something ingrained biological that made me hyper-aware of every shift in his scent, every subtle change in the way his body angled toward mine when I was in pain, the way Alphas are built to respond to distress in Omegas, whether they want to or not. I asked him about it one evening, half out of curiosity and half out of the reckless honesty that late-night hospital conversations seemed to encourage. "Doesn't it bother you?" I asked. "The instinct. Having to fight it every day just to be around me." He considered the question with the same seriousness he gave everything. "I used to think instinct was a weakness, something that made Alphas predictable, controllable." His thumb moved absently over the back of my hand, a habit he'd developed without seeming to notice it. "But it's different with you." "Different how?" "The instinct doesn't feel like something happening to me. It feels like something I'd choose anyway, even without it." He met my eyes, steady and unflinching in that way that still, weeks later, made my chest tighten. "I don't want to protect you because some biological switch got flipped. I want to protect you because you're you. Because you made me laugh in a sunroom with bad lighting. Because you argue with doctors on my behalf even when you're the one who's sick. Because you didn't ask me to fix your family, you just let me be angry on your behalf, and that was enough." I didn't trust my voice, so I said nothing, just tightened my fingers around his. I know Omega dynamics carry expectations, he continued, quieter now, almost hesitant, a rare crack in his usual certainty. Bonding, mating cycles, all the things people assume once an alpha and omega get close. I don't want you to feel like any of that is expected of you. Not because of illness, not because of gratitude, not for any reason except that it's what you actually want. And if I told you, I said carefully, testing each word like it might break something, that what I want is exactly the same thing you want. Something shifted in his expression. Hope, carefully guarded, the kind a man builds walls around because he's been disappointed by wanting things before. Then I'd say, he murmured, leaning close enough that his breath ghosted warm against my temple, that for the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm glad an instinct and a choice happened to agree with each other. His forehead rested against mine, gentle, unhurried, neither of us in any rush to close the last small distance between us. In that quiet hospital room, surrounded by the hum of machines and the smell of antiseptic that should have made anything feel unromantic, it somehow felt like the safest, most tender moment of my entire life. Good things, in my experience, rarely arrive without a shadow trailing close behind. Mine came in the form of Lee's mother, who arrived unannounced on a Sunday afternoon with the kind of composed fury that only came from people who'd spent a lifetime disguising control as concern. I wasn't in the room when it started. I was down the hall for scans, but I heard about it later from a nurse who'd witnessed the tail end, and I felt the aftermath the moment I returned. Walking into a room gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Lee sat rigid in the chair by the window, jaw locked tight, staring at nothing. What happened? I asked, easing myself onto the bed, watching him carefully. It took him a long moment to answer. My mother came to remind me that the board is losing patience with my absence, that there's a merger stalling because I'm not there to close it personally, that I have obligations that don't pause for, his voice caught, sharp and bitter, for personal indulgences. Personal indulgences. I repeated the phrase slowly, feeling its weight, understanding immediately who it referred to. I told her to leave. His hands were fisted on his knees. She said if I don't return by the end of the week, she'll move to have my father's old board seat reassigned. Says I've let myself get distracted by someone who isn't even. He stopped himself, but I'd already heard enough of the sentence to fill in the rest. Someone who isn't even stable, someone who isn't even family, someone who could disappear from an illness any day and leave you with nothing to show for the company you neglected. The old fear I thought I'd buried clawed back up my throat, fast and vicious. Maybe she's right, I said quietly, before I could stop myself. Maybe I am a distraction from a life you actually built. His head snapped toward me so fast it startled me. Don't, Lee. Don't you dare do what your parents did to you, and use it as a reason to push me away first, before I can prove I mean what I say. His voice cracked, the first time I'd ever heard it crack, all that careful control fracturing at the edges. I have spent my entire life building things designed to survive without needing anyone. Companies, reputations, walls. And then you walked. No, you fell, Sia, quite literally, into a hallway I was standing in, and every single thing I built stopped mattering the way it used to. That's a terrifying thing to say to someone who might not get better, I whispered. I know. He crossed the room and knelt beside my bed, taking both my hands in his eyes fierce and wet and utterly unguarded. I know it's terrifying. I'm terrified too. Every single day I watch you fight something I can't fix for you, and it's the most helpless I have ever felt in my life. But the alternative, walking away because it might hurt less later, that has never once felt like an option, not for 1 second. What about the board? Your mother? Let them reassign the seat. He said it with a finality that startled me, like he'd made the decision the moment the ultimatum left her mouth and simply hadn't said it out loud yet. I built that company once. I can build something else. I cannot build another version of you. You're not replaceable, Sean. Nothing about you is replaceable. Tears slid down my face, unstoppable, and this time I didn't try to hide them, didn't turn toward the window the way I used to. I let him see me, fully, unguarded, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. I don't know how much time I have, I admitted, the fear finally spoken aloud instead of buried. The doctors still aren't certain the treatment is working. Then we don't waste whatever time exists, he said fiercely, pressing his lips to my knuckles, to my palm, to the inside of my wrist where my pulse beat too fast and too fragile and entirely, stubbornly alive. We don't spend it wondering if this is real. It's real. I choose you, Sean Elias Thomas. Illness, uncertainty, no guarantees. I choose you anyway, every single day, for as many days as we get. I don't remember deciding to kiss him. I only remember the moment our lips met, soft and searching and achingly gentle, like he was afraid I might break and determined, at the same time, to prove that I wouldn't. Not with him there, not ever again. The treatment began working the following week. Nobody could explain exactly why. The doctors offered careful hedged theories about stress reduction, about the measurable impact emotional stability had on immune response, about the strange, stubborn resilience of the human body when it finally had something worth fighting for. I had my own theory, less scientific and infinitely more certain. I had someone in my corner now, and my body, tired of fighting everything alone, had finally decided it was allowed to rest into that. My fevers broke and stayed broken. My numbers, the ones the doctors watched with such careful, guarded hope, began climbing in the right direction. Color returned to my face in a way that made the nurses comment on it during rounds, a small, pleased surprise in their voices that felt like its own kind of victory. Lee was there for every single milestone. He'd started bringing his laptop into my room, running whatever remained of his business from the visitor chair beside my bed, occasionally snapping into sharp, efficient calls with board members before turning right back to me with a softness that seemed more and more like it belonged only to me. "You didn't have to give up the merger," I told him one afternoon, watching him close his laptop after another tense call. "I didn't give it up. I delayed it, on my terms, and made it clear that if the board couldn't handle a delay, they could find someone else to run the company." He said it simply, like it hadn't been a monumental, life-altering decision. Turns out, when you've spent a decade making a company profitable, people are willing to wait a few weeks for you to sit beside someone who matters. And if they hadn't been willing to wait, then I would have found something else to build. He reached over, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead with a tenderness that still, even now, caught me by surprise every time. "I already told you. Nothing I've built matters more than this." I turned my face into his palm, closing my eyes, letting myself simply feel it. The warmth, the steadiness, the astonishing, undeserved luck of having found someone who chose to stay when staying was hard. When staying offered no guarantees, when staying meant sitting beside uncertainty every single day and refusing to flinch. "I love you," I said, the words slipping out before I'd fully decided to say them, quiet and unrehearsed and more terrifying than any diagnosis I'd received in that hospital. Lee went very still. For a moment, I worried I'd moved too fast, said too much, handed him something he wasn't ready to hold. Then his expression broke open into that rare, precious smile, the one that still, weeks later, felt like a gift every single time I earned it. "I love you too," he said, voice rough with something that sounded suspiciously like relief, like he'd been waiting to say it and simply hadn't found the right moment until I handed it to him. "I think I have since that first night, listening to you cry through a wall and hating that I couldn't do anything about it yet. You did something about it eventually." "I did everything about it eventually." He leaned down, resting his forehead against mine the way he did now, our own private gesture, unhurried and certain. "And I intend to keep doing everything about it for as long as you'll let me." The day I was finally discharged, 6 weeks after my mother walked out of that chair and never came back the same person. Lee arrived with a bag of my clothes instead of hospital scrubs, and an expression so carefully controlled it took me a moment to recognize the emotion underneath it as nervousness. "You look like you're about to propose a merger," I teased, easing my way out of the hospital bed under my own power for the first time in what felt like forever. In a way, he said, and something in his tone made me pause. I've been thinking about where you'll go once you're discharged. My chest tightened. I hadn't let myself think too far past this exact day. The reality that once I left this room, I'd need somewhere to actually live. And the apartment I'd shared with roommates before the diagnosis had long since been given up, my things scattered into storage while I fought for my life in a hospital bed. I had nowhere, really, that felt like home. I was going to figure something out, I said, trying to keep my voice light, failing. You could stay with me. He said it fast, almost too fast, like he'd rehearsed it and still couldn't quite believe he was saying it out loud. Not as a temporary arrangement, not out of obligation. I have space. More than I need. And I would very much like to wake up every morning knowing you're safe instead of wondering. Lee, I know it's fast. His hands found mine, steady despite the vulnerability written plainly across his face. I know 6 weeks in a hospital isn't the traditional timeline for this kind of decision, but nothing about how I feel for you has followed any traditional timeline, and I'm done pretending otherwise for the sake of looking sensible. I thought about the empty chair my mother left behind. I thought about the door clicking shut, soft and devastating. I thought about a voice through a paper-thin wall arguing with doctors on behalf of a stranger bringing tea he remembered, from an offhand comment choosing me over a boardroom over his mother's ultimatums. Over every safe and sensible thing he could have chosen instead. Yes, I said before he could second-guess himself into taking it back. Yes, I'll stay with you. The smile that broke across his face then was the widest I'd ever seen. Unguarded, brilliant, entirely undone, like 6 weeks of careful restraint had finally been given permission to fall away completely. He kissed me right there in the hospital room, careful of the last remaining monitor still taped to my chest, and it tasted like relief and hope, and the particular hard-won sweetness of two people who had both, in their own ways, been left alone before finding each other. Lee's apartment was nothing like I expected. I'd braced myself for something cold and corporate, all glass and steel and the kind of minimalism that photographed well but felt lonely to live inside. Instead, I found rooms with warm lighting, shelves crowded with books that looked genuinely read rather than decoratively placed, a kitchen that smelled faintly of the coffee he apparently drank too much of, even on his days off. It's not what I expected, I admitted, standing in the doorway of what he told me, almost shyly, would be my room if I wanted it, though the way he said it made it clear he hoped I'd eventually stop needing a room of my own at all. What did you expect? Something colder, to match the reputation. He huffed, something almost like a laugh. The reputation exists because it's useful in boardrooms. It was never supposed to follow me home. It followed you into a hospital room for 6 weeks. That's different. He crossed to where I stood, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear with a gentleness that still undid me every time. That was never coldness. That was me learning, for the first time in years, that I wanted something enough to fight for it without caring how it looked. I spent the following weeks recovering in that apartment, regaining strength in small, steady increments. A walk to the corner and back, then 2 blocks, then eventually the whole park down the street. Lee's hand in mine the entire time, patient, in a way I hadn't known alphas of his reputation could be. He learned my habits the way he learned everything, with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. Which mug I preferred my tea in, that I liked the windows cracked at night even in cold weather. That certain hospital sound still made me flinch weeks after discharge, and that the flinch faded faster when he simply took my hand and said nothing. Let his presence do the reassuring instead of words. I learned him too. That he ran his company like he ran everything else in his life, with fierce, protective precision. But that underneath the sharp edges was someone who kept every note I'd ever written him. Who still had the folded blanket from that first hospital chair tucked carefully in a drawer, who checked twice, sometimes 3 times a day, just to make sure I was all right. Not out of anxiety, but out of a devotion so deep it had nowhere else to go except toward careful, constant attention. You still worry, I told him one night, curled against his side on the couch, the city lights scattered gold across the window. I'll always worry a little, he admitted. You almost weren't here. I don't think that fear ever fully leaves. I'm here now. You are. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his arms tightening around me, steady and sure. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have every reason to stay. They reached out again eventually. My mother first with a stiff, careful text, asking if we could talk, and then my father weeks later, with an even stiffer phone call that mostly consisted of silences neither of us knew how to fill. I agreed to meet them, once, at a coffee shop that felt safely neutral. Lee offered to come, and when I hesitated, he simply said, "I'll be at the table next to you, not to interfere, just so you know you're not walking in there alone this time." That single sentence did something to me that I couldn't quite put into words. The quiet, certain promise of never being left in a room by myself again. My parents looked older than I remembered, worn down by something that might have been guilt, though I no longer trusted myself to read intentions into their expressions the way I once had. "We should have stayed," my mother said, twisting her hands around a coffee cup she never drank from. "I know that now." "You should have," I agreed, no anger left in the words, just quiet, tired honesty. "But you didn't, and I can't pretend that didn't change something between us permanently." "Can we fix it?" my father asked, the first real question he'd asked me in months. I glanced toward the next table where Lee sat with his own coffee, close enough to be present, far enough to give me room. His eyes finding mine with a warmth that steadied something in my chest before I even answered. "Maybe, eventually, in small pieces," I said honestly. "But I'm not the same person who needed you to prove I mattered. I found people who showed me that without me having to ask. I'm willing to let you back in slowly, if you're willing to actually stay this time. But I won't build my worth around whether you choose to." They didn't have an answer for that, not really, but something in the way they nodded. Slow, chastened, genuinely trying, felt like the smallest possible beginning of something that might, eventually, become real again. When I returned to Lee's table, he reached for my hand without a word, and I let the weight of the conversation settle into something manageable, held steady by the simple fact that whatever happened with my parents, I was no longer facing any of it alone. A year passed the way years do when you're finally, fully living instead of merely surviving, full of small, ordinary joys that felt, after everything, anything but ordinary. Morning coffee, arguments over which restaurant to try, the particular comfort of falling asleep every night beside someone who had never once, not for a single day, made me doubt that he'd still be there in the morning. He took me back to the hospital garden on the anniversary of the day we first spoke through that paper-thin wall, a small, unassuming courtyard with string lights the hospital had strung up for exactly this kind of occasion, patients and families needing somewhere gentle to sit. "Why here?" I asked, though some instinctive part of me already suspected the answer, my heart picking up in a way that had nothing to do with illness anymore. "Because this is where it started," he said, taking both my hands in his voice steady despite the emotion clearly written across his face. "A year ago, I heard you crying through a wall, and something in me decided I would spend the rest of my life making sure you never had to cry alone again." He knelt then, right there on the gravel path beneath the string lights, and produced a small velvet box that made my breath catch entirely. "Sean Elias Thomas," he said, voice rough with an emotion he no longer bothered hiding, "you walked, stumbled into my life in a hospital hallway, and every single thing I thought I knew about strength and control and needing no one fell apart within a week. You taught me that the people worth building a life around are the ones who stay in the hardest moments, not just the easy ones. I want to be that person for you, for the rest of however many years we get. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred my vision. The good kind this time. The kind that came from being wholly, completely chosen instead of left behind. "Yes," I said, pulling him up and into me before he could even finish opening the box completely. "Yes, of course, yes." The kiss that followed was soft and certain, and tasted like every hard thing we'd survived to reach this exact moment. The empty chair, the paper-thin wall, the fever that nearly took everything the boardroom he'd walked away from, the family that had to learn to earn its way back in slowly, All of it had led here, to a garden lit with string lights, to a man kneeling in front of me with his whole heart finally, fearlessly on display. I wish I could say the fear disappeared entirely once we found each other. That love alone was enough to erase every trace of what my body had been through. It wasn't. Recovery, I learned, isn't a straight line. It loops back on itself sometimes, cruel and unannounced, just when you've started to believe the worst is permanently behind you. It happened 8 months into our engagement, on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday. I'd gone in for a routine follow-up scan, the kind I'd had a dozen times without incident, expecting nothing more than the usual mild inconvenience of sitting still in a paper gown for 20 minutes. The doctor's face told me something was wrong before she said a single word. "There's a shadow we didn't expect," she said carefully, turning her screen toward me, pointing at something I didn't have the vocabulary to understand, but understood the shape of anyway. The shape of bad news trying to soften itself. It could be nothing. Scar tissue, sometimes, presents this way. But given your history, we want to run additional tests before we assume that. I called Lee from the parking garage, my hands shaking too hard to properly hold the phone against my ear. He didn't ask a single unnecessary question. He simply said, "I'm coming. Don't drive yourself home," and was standing beside my car within 11 minutes, having apparently abandoned an active board meeting mid-sentence to reach me. "You didn't have to leave a meeting," I said, my voice thin and strange even to my own ears. "There is no meeting more important than this," he said, pulling me against his chest right there in the parking garage, uncaring of who might see an alpha holding an omega like something precious and breakable in a concrete stairwell. "Tell me what they said. All of it. Don't soften it for me," I told him. I watched his jaw tighten with each word, watched the same controlled, contained fury I'd first heard through a hospital wall over a year ago rise up again. Not directed at me, never at me, but at the unfairness of it, at a universe that seemed determined to test us over and over just to see if we'd break. The following week was the hardest of our relationship. Additional scans. A biopsy that left me sore and terrified in equal measure. Days spent waiting for results that felt like they stretched into years, each hour dragging with a particular agonizing slowness I remembered too well from that first hospital stay. Lee didn't leave my side once. He canceled meetings without apology, delegated responsibilities he'd once refused to hand off to anyone, and sat beside me in waiting rooms holding my hands so tightly I sometimes had to remind him to loosen his grip. "I can't lose you," he admitted one night, voice cracking in the dark of our bedroom, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard him. "I built an entire life around the promise that you'd be in it. I don't know how to go back to the version of myself that existed before you." "You won't have to," I said, though I had no real way of promising that, no certainty to offer beyond my own stubborn hope. "Whatever this is, we face it exactly the way we faced everything else, together." The results came back benign. Scar tissue, exactly as the doctor had first, cautiously hoped. An old shadow of the trauma my body had survived, not a new threat rising to replace it. I remember the relief hitting me so hard, I nearly collapsed in the doctor's office. Lee's arms, the only thing keeping me upright, his face pressed into my hair, breathing hard like he'd been holding his breath for the entire agonizing week. "We're okay," I whispered against his shoulder, needing to say it aloud, needing to make it real. "We're okay," he repeated, and I felt the words shudder through his chest, relief and terror and love all tangled together into something too large for either of us to fully contain. That night, we didn't celebrate loudly. We simply lay together in bed, tangled in each other, saying very little, because sometimes the deepest relief doesn't need words. It only needs presence, needs proof, needs the simple, undeniable fact of two heartbeats still beating steadily side by side. "I want to move the wedding up," Lee said quietly into the dark, hours later, when I thought he'd already fallen asleep. "Why?" "Because I don't want to wait for perfect circumstances anymore. I don't think perfect circumstances exist. I just want to be married to you as soon as possible, scar tissue and uncertain scans and everything else included, because none of that changes what I feel for you. It only makes me more certain I don't want to spend one unnecessary day not calling you my husband. We moved the wedding up by 4 months. Neither of us ever regretted it. There's a particular kind of miracle in ordinary mornings once you've survived something that nearly took them from you entirely. I think about that often now, in the quiet, unremarkable rhythm of our life together. Coffee brewing, while Lee reads through emails at the kitchen counter still in the soft gray sweater he refuses to admit is his favorite. Glasses pushed up into his hair because he always forgets he's wearing them until he needs to read something small. I think about it when I catch him watching me across the room with an expression too soft for a man once known throughout an entire industry for his ruthless composure, an expression he no longer bothers hiding from me, or from anyone. We took a trip to the coast the summer after our wedding, a belated honeymoon neither of us had time for immediately after the ceremony. I remember standing on a rented balcony overlooking water so blue it looked unreal. Lee's arms wrapped around me from behind, his chin resting against the top of my head. "Do you ever think about that first night?" I asked, watching the waves roll in, steady and endless. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to not being in that hallway when you stumbled. If I'd stayed in my room 5 minutes longer. If I hadn't decided to walk that particular stretch of corridor." "You would have found another way in," I said, certain of it now in a way I hadn't been then. "You're not the kind of person who lets important things happen by accident. You would have found me eventually, one way or another." "Maybe," he said, pressing a kiss to my temple. "But I'm glad I didn't have to find out the hard way. I'm glad it happened exactly the way it did, even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts, honestly. They're what taught me what staying actually means." We spent that week doing nothing particularly remarkable. Long walks along the shore, quiet dinners at small restaurants with mismatched chairs, mornings spent simply existing beside each other without any urgency to be anywhere else. It was, without question, the happiest week of my entire life, precisely because of how unremarkable it was. I had spent so long believing that survival was the most I could hope for. I hadn't understood until Lee that survival could eventually become something so much larger, a whole, ordinary, deeply loved life, built one small choice at a time by someone who simply refused to leave. People sometimes ask me, now, how I knew Lee was different. How, after being left behind by the people who should have loved me unconditionally, I found the courage to trust someone new so completely, so quickly. I never have a simple answer. I only know that trust, real trust, isn't built from grand gestures or perfect words. It's built from small, repeated choices. A second breakfast tray sent without explanation, a folded blanket left on an empty chair, an argument fought loudly with doctors on behalf of someone who wasn't even technically his to fight for, a hand that didn't let go during the worst night of a fever, a name memorized and listed as an emergency contact before anything between us was even official. It's built from a man who chose, over and over, in small moments nobody else was watching, to stay. I think about that first night often. The sound of my mother's door closing, soft and final, and how certain I was in that moment that I would spend whatever time I had left completely, irrevocably alone. I didn't know, not yet, that on the other side of a paper-thin wall, someone was already deciding that wouldn't be true. That a cold-guarded alpha with a reputation for ruthless efficiency in every boardroom he entered would spend the following weeks dismantling every wall he'd built around himself, one deliberate choice at a time, simply because he'd heard someone crying and refused to let it happen again. Lee still keeps that folded blanket. It sits on the armchair in our living room, now worn soft from years of use, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, I catch him running his thumb absently over the frayed edge of it, remembering the way I remember. Exactly how far we've come from that first terrible night. "Regretting anything?" I asked him once, only half joking, watching him hold it. "Only that it took a broken hallway collision for me to find you," he said, pulling me down beside him, settling my head against his chest where I could hear the steady, certain rhythm of his heartbeat. I would have found you eventually. I just wish I hadn't wasted so many years not knowing you existed." "You found me exactly when I needed finding," I told him honestly. "Any earlier, and I don't think I would have known how to let someone stay." He pressed a kiss to my forehead, quiet and certain, the string lights from our small balcony garden casting soft gold light across the room, and I thought, not for the first time, that some of the most important love stories don't start with grand declarations at all. Sometimes they start with a door closing on one side of a hospital wall and a voice, quiet and unwavering, refusing to let that be the end of the story on the other. We got married in that same hospital courtyard, string lights overhead, the same gravel path beneath our feet where he'd knelt a year before. It felt right. Not morbid, not strange, but fitting. A way of honoring the place where two broken, guarded people had found, against every reasonable expectation, exactly what they needed in each other. My parents came. They sat quietly near the back, still earning their way back into the version of trust I'd once given so easily, but present, at least, in a way that mattered more than words could. Lee's mother did not attend. He told me, simply, that some doors close permanently, and that he'd made his peace with that a long time ago, the same week he chose me over a boardroom, and never once looked back with regret. When the ceremony ended and the small, gathered crowd dispersed into quiet conversation and soft laughter, Lee pulled me aside beneath the same string lights and rested his forehead against mine, the way he always did in our most important moments. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing the question I'd asked him once, a lifetime, and a diagnosis ago. "None," I said, and meant it completely. "You never let me stay left behind, not once, not for a single day since that first night." "I never will," he promised, voice steady with the same unwavering certainty that had carried us through fevers and family and every hard, uncertain thing life had thrown at us since. "That's not a promise I intend to break. Not while I'm still breathing." I believed him. I believed him the way I'd learned slowly and carefully to believe in things again. Not blindly, not naively, but with the hard-won trust of someone who had watched a person prove, day after day, in ways both small and enormous, exactly who he was. The cold alpha in the room next door had, in the end, never once let me stay alone. And in the years since, in every ordinary morning and every quiet evening that followed, he never did again. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.